sewer connections. We live in a subdivision in the county but are surrounded by city annexed lands and streets with city sewer service. Our subdivision is all on septic tanks near Lake Lafayette. I'm not sure that folks here are in the position to talk about what city-county plans are. Am I
Well, there's a lot. I mean,
correct?
We've been working a little bit with the sales tax committee, and this is just general. These are projects that are just proposed. I don't know, they're not like approved or anything. But we have sort of the McCullough group that's been pushing to have certain areas considered for possible sewering. And so there's actually a list that came out today on a matrix that has the sales tax projects, and a number of them are areas that are all high concentrations of septic tanks. The area that you described, I don't know if that's one of them. There are a number of areas, like I said, there's Gorn Acres and Lakeshore Drive, but then you have the area out by the airport, and then you also have Woodville, and you have areas like that are high concentrations of septic tanks. And there are plans being considered, but none of them are approved yet, as far as I know, that for sewering these areas. And that's one of the possible solutions.
Okay, and the little bit that I know, the suggestion I would have would be to get involved with the sales tax committee, follow their meetings. They're meeting here on Thursday night to talk about what to do with the potential revenues. Okay, we're going to have some geological questions here. First question, what can we do to divert the water from the swallets that do not have the protective clay layer to prevent the contaminants from going into the aquifer? So I'm going to...
Well, what I would say is we don't need to be diverting any water away from these swallets because that's part of the entire water budget of the system. So we don't want to take any water away, but what we want to do is go into these basins and figure out how to clean the water up before it gets to the swallet. That would be my suggestion.
I agree. Wakulla Springs, if you look back way in the past, it was a very clear spring all the time. So the natural system produces a clear spring. So the water going to the swallet's not the problem. You just need to make sure it's acting as natural as it can, and then that was protections.
And remember too, many of these swallets are actually fed by streams that come out of the Apalachicola National Forest. So presumably that water quality is pretty good coming out of an undeveloped area. So we don't really have to worry about those, and that's where the majority of the large swallets are that take a lot of surface water. They're sourced in the Apalachicola National Forest.
Meetings we had in Wakulla Springs, it was often being debated about the water, the sort of brown water that was entering and keeping the boats from going. To me, that seemed more like a human problem. A lot of that was coming off of the Apalachicola National Forest, as these gentlemen were telling you, and it's fairly clean water. It might have a lot of tannic acid in it, but it might keep the boats from seeing down to the bottom, the glass bottom boats. But that's a human problem. It's not an environmental problem. That's my take.
And of unraveling the mysteries of the underwater pathways, the kind of thing that the Woodville Karst Project has done. This person's asking if there has been any work to do a similar thing, starting with the lakes and the sinks that are associated with our major lakes. Is there any charting underway of the underground pathways for the flow in these
That occur
areas?
in the major lake basins. I am unaware of any effort to have anybody dive into those and map the extent of the cave systems under them. But I will tell you that when Lake Jackson went down Porter Sink, a number of geologists actually, once it dried up enough, climbed down into that sinkhole and down into the cave system, and we did map a little bit of that cave system. But it turns out, once you get deep enough in there, it becomes too cramped for people to get down into anyway. So many of these features are going to be too small to get anybody in anyway. But the dye tracing might be a way to get a handle on, at least from point to point where these things are. You may not be able to map the cave system out specifically.
Affect Wakulla Springs many years ago?
That's a counter. That's a really good question. It's really complicated because one thing we're seeing in Spring Creek is obviously in a tidal channel, so it's very susceptible to, it's very sensitive to sea level. And if you look back over the last 1930s to present day, the sea level has gone up about half a foot in this area. And during this, we did 3 years of data collection at Spring Creek, and 4 times the sea pushed its way back in, and it stopped the flow in Spring Creek. And all that flow was shifted to Wakulla Springs. And when it shifts the water, it shifts the tannic water too. So it looks like, if you look at all the data collected in Wakulla Springs, the Wakulla Spring flow is getting higher and higher. It's been increasing for that entire period, 1930 to present day. It's been creeping, it's about doubled, it's been creeping up. And it looks like it's just taking in more, more water is flowing to Wakulla and more low quality water is flowing to Wakulla. And it may be that that's causing the visibility to change over that period.
Let me make a quick point, Hal, and I know what you mean by this, but just because the water is tannic doesn't mean it's low quality.
Oh, yeah.
It may be low quality from a perspective of somebody wanting to see down into the spring, but there's nothing dirty about tannic water at all, and it is a natural part of the system. That's true.
Okay, the next question is, how about the quantity of water used and pumped? We heard a lot about quality, not so much about quantity. Does anyone want to dive into that?
Right now, if you add up, if you take the flow in Wakulla Springs and Spring Creek and you add it together, it's about 800 cubic feet per second. The city of Tallahassee, which is the major user of aquifer water, it's about 50 cubic feet per second. So 800, we're using about 50, and that's a really heavy day in the summer. And then they take that and they put about half of it back on the spray field. So they're consuming about 25 cubic feet per second out of 800. So we're not really overstressing the system right now. We're still on wastewater. And then there's a lot of individual private wells that consume some water too. As far as total quantity, about not having quantity in the future, we're probably okay there. The problem is any water you take out of the aquifer is not going to come out of spring. So virtually, however much you pump, unless you put it back on the ground, spray field or some other way, you're going to lose it. So you will affect spring flows some. Probably not a lot right now.
All right. Anyone else want to pipe in?
No, I mean, one quick thing, and it just has from looking at other places around the state where the water quantity issue has been more involved. If you're looking at a first magnitude spring, it's probably a drop in the bucket, so to speak, right now with the amount we're taking out. But if you looked at groundwater, other small seepages or other small springs in the area that are much more tenuous, or wetlands that are on the surface, and you start to have that draw down, you will see effects on them much sooner than you would see anything happening with Wakulla. That's true. So there are a lot of other effects that are part of that equation.
And so too is climate. Remember, for the last 10 years, or even longer, we've been in a fairly extended drought. So that's less water to get into the system as well. So drought and consumptive uses play a role in how much water comes out of springs.
Thank you. Okay, the drawing of aquifer water from Tallahassee and surrounding area use reduces the water pressure and allows the saline incursion to increase, correct? So given that, if that is correct, would further development affect this in the future? And is this something that we should look at from a growth management standpoint? And this person offers solutions, a less quantity, water use, I guess, per capita, less chemical pollution with pesticides and herbicides. And then what about runoff from asphalt? Those are a lot of questions. I guess we'll take the first one first, is the part about reducing water pressure. Does the actual consumptive use reduce the water pressure and enhance the problem of saline intrusion?
It would reduce it some, but since we're not using a huge percentage of the water, it'd be hard to measure the effect. But to me, you don't waste water. And you should always strive to conserve water and use it as the minimum amount possible, because that's going to have the minimal effect on the system. So I'm all for water conservation.
Okay, and then I guess these other, it's phrased as a question, so you address that, yes, using less quantity is very desirable. Chemical pollution with pesticides and herbicides, yes, anyone?
I think all of us would agree that using less pesticides and fertilizers when possible is a prudent thing to do, particularly in an area that is highly vulnerable to groundwater contamination, like the karst areas of Florida. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely true. Let me go back real quickly to the water use and saltwater issue. Sometimes it's difficult for people to visualize what the water, freshwater lens in our aquifer system looks like. And a good analogy, if you think about it, you know, the Florida Peninsula is surrounded on both sides by ocean, by seawater. And at some depth beneath us, the water in the aquifer system is salt water. So you can envision sort of like a big bubble of fresh water is sitting in our aquifer systems. And that's a good way to think about it. And certainly as you stick straws in it and start to pull out water, that bubble is going to shrink. And when it shrinks, it's replaced by salt water. So, you know, any consumptive use has an impact. As Hal said, you know, our impact in this area so far is pretty minimal, but that could certainly change.
Okay, here's another quality issue, and this question is, how does runoff from the big farms in South Georgia affect the Floridan aquifer?
We don't really know. The big farms is, I'm assuming you're talking about over in the near Flint River, the Doris Plains, and a lot of that farm runoff may not affect us so much, but it's going to affect the Flint River because there's a lot of spring. I showed the first map I showed had the river on there. The Flint River is heavily impacted by spring flow, and there's a lot of farms, and the nitrate level in their springs, like Mariana Blue is one I know of, that's in Florida. It's about 6 milligrams per liter. Wakulla is about 0.7. So the order of magnitude of their problem is much greater than our problem. Our problem is solvable. Solving the Mariana problem, their nitrate level is pretty much hard.
I'd say too, this has a good educational thing that anybody can do is you go on Google Earth and you kind of drill down to our region and you look up north, up in the lake, up in the Jackson Blue Spring area, just north of that, and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of large circular irrigation things on the area. And they just go for miles and miles and miles and miles. And each one of those is drilling down a well and sucking out a lot of water. Even if they're doing good practices and trying to reduce their water consumption, when you have hundreds and maybe thousands of those big circular irrigation devices, they draw a lot of water and put a lot of fertilizer on.
Okay, thank you. We speak of contaminants being from rainwater. What about the contaminants we put in the water? I guess they mean stormwater. What about the contaminants that we put in water, such as fluoride and chlorine? Is there any human health concern on those elements?
You may have the wrong panel for a toxicology question.
Toxicology question? Okay, yeah. See, scientists know when it's like, okay. I think
We
that's
should know
good.
our limitations.
Question, yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, but I'm a planner, so I don't.
Okay, here's another question about chemical components that could be affecting our water. What about water softeners and the use of those? Do those have a detrimental effect on our water systems?
Well, I'll speak up a little bit. I know this is really from your shop when you were at USGS. I think Brian was looking at pharmaceuticals and doing a number of studies on the amount of pharmaceuticals that were showing up in the groundwater in the Wakulla Basin and in other basins around the state too, and it was pretty interesting to find out that, you know, antidepressants and I don't know if aspirin, but I know antidepressants and a variety of Huh?
Caffeine.
Caffeine, anything that you either flush down the toilet or use the toilet and then flush is in the water. So that was something, it was very interesting to hear that and to begin to think about maybe programs to collect and help people dispose of their pharmaceuticals in the proper way rather than, as historically, everybody's just dumped them down the toilet.
But what about the salts that people put in water or something?
Well,
Is that an issue?
I don't know that anybody's really done a definitive study to look at whether or not that's an impact on water quality. But the water in the Floridan aquifer system is naturally full of all these dissolved ions like calcium and magnesium and all these other things. So these salts, disassociate and put those ions back in. So, just from a shoot from the hip kind of thing, I would say that would probably be my least worry. And fertilizers and pesticides and all the other things that we know are carcinogens and can have a negative impact on flora and fauna in springs would be a bigger issue to me.
Okay. I guess wrapping up the issue of stormwater, is there anything specific you want to say about stormwater treatment and kind of where we stand on doing a good job with that? Because we saw the presentation of how what you get south of the Cody Scarp, the stormwater is an issue. What contaminants are of concern, and where do you think we are in stopping them from entering the aquifer?
I don't know exactly what we're doing now, but I know I live over near Lake Jackson. I live in the Fred George Sink Basin, and I know whenever it rains in my house, the water curves back around and then makes its way back to Fred George Sink, and then it goes down into the aquifer. So anything that happens on land, surface, fertilizer, or whatever, it's going to make it to that sinkhole in my area. And Lake Lafayette has a sinkhole in the bottom of it, so the stormwater runoff from the city will make it to that sinkhole. Remember, I can't address what they're doing, but it's something you need to be aware of.
Well, I'll address it for a minute. And what we typically do with stormwater is we try to retain it in a basin that we've dug and hold it for a while so it infiltrates very slowly. And the thought is that any of the particulate matter is filtered out as it makes its way through the bottom of the holding pond. Well, the problem exists when you dig a holding pond in a karst region. What's likely to happen? Sinkhole. A sinkhole is likely to form. In fact, the Alberta Crate, the big giant retention pond right behind Doak Campbell Stadium, right before that was slated to go into full use, about 15 to 20 sinkholes opened in the bottom of that thing. So that pretty much defeats the entire purpose of having a retention pond. So I think as we're planning where to put these retention ponds, we ought to have geologists help us at least cite where these things are going to go, and certainly help them monitor them for the potential for sinkhole activity. Because the last thing you want to do is create another Swallette somewhere where stormwater runoff is going underground. And in these karst regions, it's probably going to have to, before we clean that stuff up, or before we send it back into the ground, it's probably going to have to be treated in order to really effectively clean up the stormwater runoff. Because retention ponds in a karst region, they don't do what they're supposed to do most of the time, or many times, I should say.
On a planning aspect, we had, and this is something that didn't come to pass, but it's something we've worked on with DEP and with the city and others. I think when St. Joe was planning these, I'm going to get it wrong, the other, not Southwood, but South, whatever it was, another DRI they were planning. And so we were looking at the stormwater system with them, and we were suggesting that maybe rather than digging a large retention ponds and things like that are susceptible to having these sort of pipe sinkholes develop in them, that maybe they do a much more distributive approach where they have many, many smaller systems, more like the low-impact development approaches that are popular around the nation, but a karst version of that. And so that you, in many places on your property, you collect, treat, but in very smaller versions, not deep. And then bring them together and out off the property.
Maybe import some clay?
Maybe import some clay.
Okay, thank you. And Can you specifically direct people to a good source online for the best practices for people with stormwater management? I guess, you know, the TAP program, but is there any other mother lode of, is that a good entry point?
So you can also go to the DEP website. We've got a lot of resources there.
Okay.
You can type in Florida Springs. FloridaSprings.org is a great website full of all kinds of resources about how to be a good steward of water resources in the springs areas. I know there's a big manual that the former head of it's now the Economic Opportunity Department.
Community affairs.
Yeah, DCA put out on springs protection.
Great.
That can be accessed through the FloridaSprings.org website.
Okay, back to geology. What has caused the limestone to develop at lower levels in western Wakulla County?
I'm assuming what you're talking about is the limestone as it's diving down into the feature we're talking about. The feature is called the Apalachicola Embayment, and it's just in the area where there's actually a big basin that probably was cut out by relict Apalachicola River activity. So you got a nice big basin now that's filled in with sediment, as opposed to siliceous sediment like clays and sands, as opposed to carbonate. So those carbonate rocks just have been weren't deposited near the surface down there because of this feature.
Okay, and this question, I may need some help from the person posing the question, Tim Lynch, about deep well injection in northwest Florida. Is Tim here to help me with this?
Into the Boulder Zone. There's a lot of discharge historically that's gone into the Boulder Zone as a discharge of effluent, at least when I was involved in permitting them years ago. I'm wondering if that is still into the salt level. Is that still an issue, and is there interaction with the higher levels of fresh water?
Well, I'm not an expert in deep well injection, but I know a little bit about it. The Boulder Zone occurs in South Florida, and yes, they do exploit it for the disposal of treated wastewater effluent. And they do so because they believe there is a confining unit that keeps that water from migrating upwards.
Right.
However, when you inject it in there, it goes laterally and it does go somewhere. And potentially, it might find its way back to the surface.
Nothing yet. We worried about that then, but I'm not sure.
I think, you know, occasionally a well will fail and it can make its way back up a well, but, you know, they know that because there are all kinds of monitor wells around it, and they monitor that fairly carefully. But I'm unaware of any studies that have shown, you know, that water is making its way either into freshwater aquifers or discharging somewhere where it might be detrimental.
Good, thanks.
Okay, these next couple questions are very particular, and I'm not sure they're something that we can really address, but one question is addressing the ancient geological history and saying, can you show where the island of Florida joined the southeast of the North American plate? And I guess we don't really have a map up, but if anyone wants to make a brief comment about that, that might be helpful.
Who asked that question? Can you clarify what it is you're asking?
Florida came off of the South America millions of years ago.
Africa.
Joined somewhere.
Africa. Right. Well,
somewhere in our
I'll give you a real brief geological history overview. Hundreds of millions of years ago, all the continents came together and joined into one supercontinent called Pangaea, right? Then at the end of the Paleozoic, that supercontinent started to break apart like supercontinents do, and the modern continents we know today started to form. Well, as Africa and North America, South America broke apart, a little piece of northwestern Africa was sutured to what would later become North America. And that bedrock, which is many thousands of feet below the surface, below all the limestone, it turns out it's igneous rock. Geologists know this because we've actually drilled down to it, and we have to thank the oil and gas industry for that. They're the only ones with the money and the interest to drill that deep. But that's how we figured out that that little piece of Africa is really what formed the foundation and the base for Florida. And then on top of that, we're deposited these thick sequences of limestone and dolomite. Does that sort of answer your question?
But the place that's sutured on must be somewhere between Florida and Georgia.
Yes, correct. Yeah, there's a.
Does that affect the water that you're talking about?
It's buried so deeply that it doesn't have any impact on the water that we're talking about in the Floridan Aquifer System. The Floridan Aquifer System sediments, or the bucket that holds the water that is the Floridan Aquifer System, doesn't go down that deep and is not that old.
Can I ask one follow-up? Is there uplift, in addition to the erosional thing, you were talking about the shoreline and things like that, is there also uplift?
You're going to have to fill out a blue card.
Are you teaching geology? It sounds like there's.
I'd be more than happy to come back and give you a geological overview.
Yes.
Well, to be honest with you, Dan, some geologists believe that there is some uplift going on in Florida, and the mechanism might be the dissolution of limestone. We're removing a bunch of material by dissolving away the limestone. And much like when glaciers recede from an area, that downward force of all the related ice has depressed the continent, and then once it's removed, that load is removed and the continent can rebound. Well, we believe there might be some rebound in Florida because we're removing so much of the limestone bedrock through dissolution. So yes, there could be some rebound.
Okay, one last very quick question. Everyone's been wonderfully behaved and patient. We're past our time. So what effect would a bottling plant have?
Spring, near a spring.
Near a spring.
Well, the effect would be what we've already discussed, and that is any quantity of water you take out of a spring shed is water that ultimately would make it to a spring. Now, it depends on how much water you're taking out and how rapidly you're taking it out. What's the proximity to the spring? Oftentimes, these bottled water facilities aren't permitted to take out a whole lot of water with respect to the total discharge of that spring. But yes, it does have an impact.
Thank you so much. Let's give a big